Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Stories That Inspire Us. My name is Janice Malillo, your host. Today is Wednesday, February 8th, and yes, I am that person that's always cold, but I am nice and warm and bundled up as I can be. And, stories is really about the stories behind the stories. And my guest today, number one, is amazing. She's kind of in the same line of business that I am. She is a VA, Schroeder Administrative Solutions. Whoop, almost was a tongue twister there. The beauty of live podcasting. And her story is very unique. And I will probably say grab the box of tissues because this may be one of those tear jerkers, but without further ado, I want to welcome to the Stories platform, the Stories podcast, Kristine Schroeder, my very good friend. Welcome, Kristine.
Thanks, Janice. It's nice that you had me here, and I really appreciate it. I'm excited to get started today.
Awesome. And of course, Kristine, as you know, and as our audience knows, I am also simulcasting through the Wisdom audio app. So, we're going to welcome our listeners as they come on board here. Kristine, I want to start, but I need to back up a little bit. A lot of us have demons from our past. And I think a lot of times when we are in that emotional cluster and it kind of grabs hold of us, sometimes it really pulls us in deep. Can you share with us obviously I know the backdrop of your story, but I really want our listeners and viewers to hear in your words the demons of your past from where you were to where you are now. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with us when you hear those words, because you have this bright, beautiful smile, but yet I just saw it change a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. So when I was growing up, when I was really young, my father passed away. And so I was only 7. My father was only 30. And so my mother was actually pregnant at the time when my dad passed away. And it was myself and my little sister. And then she gave birth only a week after he passed away to my brother. And so I always like to say that I think that my brother, being the only son, my brother and my dad maybe exchanged a high five in heaven as he was going up and my brother was coming. And so that was hard on my mom, but she was an amazing mom for a few years. And so from the time I was 7 until I was 13, she held it together really well. And she was super mom. And maybe she was hanging on a little bit too tight, but I was involved in all of the things and all of the activities, and I was super happy, and I had a lot of friends, and even though my dad had passed away, and that was really hard on me because I was daddy's little girl, things were going okay. And my mom eventually met a man and decided to remarry. And so we relocated from the Atlanta, Georgia area to a very, very tiny little village in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And unfortunately, the culture shock of that was enough for a 13-year-old. But on top of that, my mother started drinking. And the coming from this, the warmer climate to the colder climate, it was just really a lot of change for a 13-year-old. And unfortunately, my mother continued to drink very heavily with her new husband. And then one evening, they left the bar after it closed, and they came home, and he died in our living room. And so it was such a small town that there was no 911 service. And so I actually had to run in the middle of the night and knock on neighbors' doors to see if we could find somebody to do CPR. And unfortunately, they were not able to save him. And so now my mother had to have been in her mid-30s, and now she was twice widowed, had 3 kids, had moved across the country for this man, and now we were all alone again. And so I just can't imagine that heartbreak for her. And so I have a lot of empathy for her situation. But for my own situation at the time, of course, I was still a child and I didn't understand. And I really didn't have any support network. I had no friends. And I really, I had people who were friendly acquaintances and people who would be friendly now and then, but I really didn't have that go-to person, that ride or die person for myself. And so unfortunately, my mother remarried a 3rd time. And this gentleman I refer to as the step monster. And he was pretty rough. So he was also an alcoholic, and he had bipolar and PTSD. And unfortunately, he used to beat my mom up. And so that's kind of where my story really kind of starts, as far as understanding kind of the abuse that I suffered. And so when I tell you that my stepdad would beat up my mom, everybody understands what that means. You know, you understand that when a man hits a woman, that's abuse, obviously. But what's really hard to understand is the emotional and psychological abuse that happens in a lot of those situations, and sometimes without that hitting. And so my stepfather never touched me, but the emotional games and the gaslighting. And so the book that I'm writing is actually called Through the Fog. And I think that fog is such a great metaphor, because when you're driving and it starts to get foggy, you know, at first it's just those little wisps and you can still see fine, but there's those low hanging clouds, and it's kind of a surreal kind of experience. And you keep driving and it gets thicker and thicker until you can't see anything in front of you. And that's exactly how emotional abuse feels. So my mother, I think, just for self-preservation, also became a little bit emotionally abusive. And I think in the 80s also, if we look back at popular culture, you know, you look at the sitcom Roseanne, and a lot of that humor was just mean. It really isn't funny. If you go back and look at it now, it really isn't funny. It's just mean. But that's kind of how society viewed humor back then. And so my parents were a lot like that. And so unfortunately, he continued to be around and to be just play very odd games. So I would say, you know, can I go to the movies? And instead of just getting a flat no, I would get, go ahead, you do whatever you want anyway. And so then I would be guilty, and then I wouldn't go. And then really it got to the point where I never did what I wanted. So it was just a mind game. And then the more famous one was, they would say, I know what games you're playing and nobody's going to play anymore. Well, that didn't make any sense because I wasn't playing any games. But when you are in that situation and someone's screaming at you, you just don't understand. And you listen to them because they are your only point of information. You know, you're a kid, and I was particularly isolated because I didn't have any friends and we were in such a small town. So in high school, I had talked to the Army recruiter about possibly going into Army music. And they pretty much told me that if I wasn't the best of the best, I was never going to make it. And I knew that in the small school that I attended, I wasn't getting the best training. And so I was like, well, that's just really not an option. And so I decided to let the matter drop and think about going to college. Well, the Air Force recruiter got wind of it. And so my parents and the Air Force recruiter conspired to get me to join the Air Force. And I really believe that the step monster just wanted me out of the picture because he wanted my brother and sister to call him dad. And I was never going to do that. And he knew that. And so I didn't tell anybody this part of my story, Janice, for such a long time because I was so embarrassed that, what kind of an idiot gets tricked into going into the Air Force? That's a pretty big deal. How do you get tricked into that? And the thing is that by the time I went to the, what they call the MEPS centers, where you go to do your processing, by the time I went there, I was so afraid of my own shadow that even though there were some people saying, oh, it's not a final commitment. It's just, it's just the first round of papers and you can still change your mind. There were people in uniform pointing at the paper saying, sign here. And I did what they told me to do. And then it was time to take the oath of enlistment. And I was like, nobody told me I would have to take the oath of enlistment. I'm not prepared for this, but I just did it. Did I mean it? No, not really. Didn't even know what I was saying. Was not prepared at all. So I went in and I took the oath of enlistment. I was only 17. And so I came back to my hometown, and a quick funny story. When I was sent to the MEPS center in the first place, they put me on a bus and all by myself, 17 years old. And I go and I sit down with my book, this is before cell phones. So I go and I sit down in a seat behind a man and I have got my book, and he turns around, he puts his arm on the back of the seat and he turns around, he says, you know where I'm from? And I'm like, I don't care where you're from. Right. And he says, I'm from prison. And I was like, Princeton. He said Princeton. I'm sure he said Princeton. And I looked around, and he and several of the other people on the bus were wearing orange jumpsuits. And I was like, oh, Lord, what have I gotten myself into?
Oh my God, Chris, we've got to stop for just a moment because you just shared a lot of information about your story. And I have a lot of questions for you. I want to back up a little bit. And first of all, I'm so sorry that you lost your dad at such a very young age. And I hope that when you think back of those memories, and you had mentioned that, you were daddy's little girl, I hope that those memories still, are tucked away deep in your heart and have such meaning and depth for you. You would also mention, as a 13-year-olds, especially for girls, it's a very emotional transitioning period in our lives. And, I think back to when I was 13, if I can remember back that far, but yeah, it was a long time ago. But, Kristine, you witnessed your stepdad at that point. Your mother had remarried shortly after your dad had passed away. And you witnessed him die, and you witnessed the emotional turmoil for that. When you think back to that episode that happened, to your stepdad passing away, in that moment, what did you think how your life was going to transition yet again? Like, did you have that emotional capacity to say, okay, maybe, this happened, this sucks, or whatever. It's sad that I lost him, but, was there a bright moment somewhere in there for you?
I think that I really didn't even know him yet. My mom and this man were not even married for a year when he passed away. So I really think that we just didn't, barely had touched the surface of getting to know him. And for me, my mother continued to drink so much that when I needed a mom, I didn't have anybody. And so I remember staring out the window down the street to the bar was only like 6 houses away from our house. And I remember staring down the street and just thinking to myself, maybe it'll burn down one day, but it wouldn't have mattered because there were other bars. But that was kind of her go-to because it was so close. But I just remembered that there was a lot of rage and hatred towards the whole drinking industry. And I just remember thinking, I wish that they would all burn down, blow up, get blown away by a tornado, whatever. I just remember just wishing that they didn't exist. And that's another culture difference between Atlanta and the small town in Michigan, is not that Atlanta and the town that we lived in was a dry county or a dry city, but first of all, being a little more populated and having more crime, you just didn't leave your kids by themselves. You got a babysitter and you went out and you came home with enough capacity that you could, take the babysitter home and what have you. Whereas in Michigan, really all she had to do was walk down the street 6 houses. So she was able to really not have her senses by the time she came home. So she was able to drink from, the afternoon until bar closed. And she did almost every day. And that was the biggest problem and the biggest thing. And emotionally, I was the oldest, so I became the parent. And so on the one hand, I was always being told, you are not the parent, but I was the person who had to make sure that baths were taken and homework was done. And I didn't do the laundry, but I needed to still make sure it got into the hamper and that sort of thing. And so it was one of those things where I was constantly being told that I was still a child, but I was treated like I was an adult.
So you were acting as the parent of your parents. You are assuming the role de facto as the parent of your younger siblings, not really being the older sister. I mean, you are the older sister, oldest sibling, but you're not, because you're parenting as a parent would at such an impressionable age. What did you think when you were running around, gathering the laundry, as you said, making sure it got in the hamper, making sure all the baths were taken, homework was completed? How did that make?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is because you really never knew what was going to happen, she could walk in the door at any moment and then take over. And so you really never knew from time to time. So what would usually happen is she would go for an afternoon drink. And so then the bus would go by at 3:30, 3:45, whatever time the bus went by, and she would go to the payphone at the bar, because again, no cell phones back then. She would go to the payphone and she would call, and because she would see the bus go by, and she would say, I'm going to be home in a little bit. And every now and then supper would already have been started. So there might be some Swiss steak cooking in the slow cooker or something like that. And so she would say, I'll be home in a little bit. And so we would pretty much do what we wanted to do. I would watch General Hospital, which I was never allowed to do when she was home. And I would watch MTV, which was not allowed when she was home. So then a couple of hours later, she would call again and she would say, supper's already been started. I'll be home in just a few minutes to finish it and we'll eat dinner. And then a couple more hours would go by and she would call again and she would say, go ahead and finish making dinner for you guys and I'll eat later. And being 13, I had no idea that she wasn't eating while she was gone. I didn't know that people would go to the bar and just drink. Why would I think that? That's not normal, right? And so I had no idea that she didn't eat while she was gone. And I remember one night in particular, she came home and it had been one of those nights with the Swiss steak. And by the time she called and told me to finish it, it was so late that we were just like, I didn't feel like making the gravy. We just ate the meat, and I think maybe I made potatoes or rice or something. And so she gets home in the middle of the night and she's rummaging through the refrigerator, and I can hear her muttering, and so I foolishly get up, and she's like, I'm looking for the leftovers from tonight. And I was like, oh, I didn't make gravy. And she called me everything but white and told me how selfish I was and what was she supposed to eat now. And I remember just being like the deer in the headlights. I didn't know. Why would I know that? And I remember thinking, oh, I failed again, and there was a lot of that where I just was never good enough.
Kristine, did you know, I mean, I know this with what you're, sharing with us, you endured emotional abuse. Did you know at that time that?
No, not at all. I had no idea. Well, again, I didn't have friends either, so I didn't have someplace where I could go to experience what a normal household should be like. And looking back now as a parent myself, I wouldn't have let my children probably hang out a lot with somebody who was in my situation. I had no supervision most of the time. It was volatile at best. So you just never knew when someone was going to come home screaming and yelling. It was naive and absent a lot of the time. So, there was one time when the neighborhood kids got mad about something, and I still don't really even know what it was. And they absolutely just were going crazy outside of our house, and we had all of the doors locked and everything. They were throwing eggs and plants at our house and being destructive. And there was no police officers in that town because it was too small, and there was no 911. There was no one to call, and I didn't know where my mother was, and I don't remember at that time if she was married to anybody. I don't think she was. And so there was no one to call, and those kids knew that. And so I had to just close the curtains and ignore these people that were smashing things up against the house. And then my mom would get home and I'd be like, yeah, these kids did this stuff. And she'd be like, oh, and act like she wasn't absent during that time. So it was confusing because you started to doubt your own memories. Like, oh, maybe was she there? No, she was really not there. So I think that mostly it was just a very confusing time, a time when I just never knew what would happen next.
Wow, that's a lot to take in for a young, very impressionable 13-year-old.
Yeah, it was a rough time. And then by the time she remarried the second time to the step monster, that just was a whole new experience in trauma. And I think a lot of people discount the trauma that is watching your mother get hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were a lot of times when he was just very hateful. And so he broke her nose. I remember one Christmas Eve. I was old enough to understand how things worked for Christmas, and so she had gone out Christmas caroling, drunk Christmas caroling, and she came home, and he must have gone back to the bar, and she came home and was putting the presents under the tree and crying and very upset because he had broken her nose. And so I got out of bed and helped her put the presents under the tree, and then went back to bed. And of course, classic abused wife syndrome. She would talk about how it was an accident, he didn't mean to do it. And so on my wedding night, the same thing kind of happened. He actually broke her jaw on my wedding night. And so thankfully I didn't know about it. It did not ruin my wedding. I didn't find out about it until the next day when my best friend, who had worked at the hotel where we had our reception, she's the one that told me. And my mom again said, oh, he was sleeping and I woke him up and I startled him, and the whole story. And so and just the hateful, mean things. And they continued with the, no one's going to play your game. And so the healing for that actually began shortly before I had kids. And we actually know, I think we may have already had a couple of our kids, and we were visiting my father-in-law, and he lived about 25 miles away from my parents. And so we had come and we were staying at his house, but we had fully intended the very next day, which was Thanksgiving, to go to my parents' house. And I guess we didn't have kids yet, because now I'm remembering who was still alive. And so my mother called my father-in-law's house, and she said, well, actually, let me back up. So when the no one's playing your game, when that first happened, was when I was in the Air Force. And so to kind of tell you a little more about that story, I had decided, I had met my husband, my now husband, right before I graduated from high school. And he was the one that said, that's not a commitment. You can still tell them you don't want to do it. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do that. And so I called my mother at the bar one day, because that's where she always was. So I literally had to call the bar to talk to my mother. And I called the bar and I said, listen, I don't want to go in the Air Force. I never wanted to go in the Air Force. And I want to go to college instead. And so that was always met with, how are you going to pay for it? And being as isolated as I was, I didn't know that college loans even existed. I didn't know anything about a Pell Grant or any kind of grant. And I was never going to be eligible for scholarships because my grades were just mediocre. And so I didn't know how I was going to be able to do it. And I had gotten accepted to Northern Michigan University, but on academic probation. And so my mother would say, well, you're not really accepted. So that was all part of the kind of that gaslighting, that really the Air Force was my only choice because I was a terrible student and I didn't have any money. And so I said, well, I don't want to do it. And by now, my husband and I, that relationship, my parents thought that was going to be kind of a summer fling, and it had gotten more serious, and they were a little bit surprised by that. This was October. I was scheduled to go in November. And so in October, the recruiter had been replaced by a new recruiter, because as most people know, they cycle through pretty, like maybe every 2 years or so. So this new recruiter was a female, and she and her supervisor and my mother and I sat at our kitchen table with the step monster just a room over in the living room, and everyone just browbeat me. You can't go through life backing out of commitments. You signed the papers. What are you going to do instead? What's your life going to be like? And so really just manipulated me. And I was strong enough to say, I'm not going to give you an answer right now. And so they gave me 3 days. And in the 3 days, my parents wouldn't let my siblings talk to me at all, not even to say, pass the pepper. And it was funny because they attempted to try not to go to the bar during those 3 days because they were trying to control me. But it didn't work because they couldn't stay out of the bar that long. And so eventually they did end up going back to the bar, but I folded and I agreed to go into the Air Force. So I went all the way through basic training, having no idea what job they would give me. And then they sent me to tech school. And tech school, I finally had some freedom. And so I remember this one time I was shopping and somebody came up to me and was like, your parents called. And of course, this was still payphone era. So they had called into the dormitory barracks type of area that I lived in. And they had called the common payphone and they said it was an emergency. So I rushed back and I said, and I called back and I said, what's wrong? I'll tell you what's wrong. Nobody's playing this game that you're playing. Everybody's sick and tired of everything you're doing. And don't call your uncle. Don't call your grandparents. They don't want to hear from you. And so dutifully, I didn't call anybody. And that further isolated me. So when the healing began was this Thanksgiving a couple of years later. I was out of the Air Force. My husband and I were together, newly married. And my mother calls my father-in-law's house and she says, no one's playing this game. Everybody's tired of everything you're doing. Don't call anybody. And I called everybody. I called my uncle, who's my favorite uncle. And I said, listen, my mom's telling me you don't want to hear from me. He said, what? I always want to hear from you, baby. I called my mother's mother. I said, listen, this is what she's saying. And she said, no, I always want to hear from you. And I called my dad's mom and I told her, and she changed her will. She cut my mother out of the will because until then, my dad had been her only child. So we were her only family. She cut my mother out of the will because of what I said that night. And that was the beginning of me realizing that's not healthy and that's not okay. So that was the beginning.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
Right. Yeah.
Gaslighting, stories, come back to the phone. You're thinking it's an emergency. Did somebody get hurt? Did somebody die? You're not playing this game. As you move through life and as you've structured yourself in such a way, you have an amazing husband, a beautiful family, Schroeder Administrative Solutions, your VA business. When you look back on that, what do you think is one of the biggest things that stands out to you that when you look back at it and you think, wow, I've overcome a ton of stuff?
I think that my faith is a big part of that. I think that I'm so very blessed that I had that 13 years in Atlanta where we went to church regularly, and I was able to hold on to that. Before my dad passed away, we attended a Baptist church, and in the Baptist church, they wait until children are old enough to make the decision themselves before they're baptized. And my dad was baptized just a little bit before he passed away. And shortly after he passed away, I was baptized. And I always believed that, yeah, I'll get to meet Jesus one day, but more importantly, I'll get to see my dad again, right? And I say that tongue in cheek. So anyone who's listening, I completely understand the faith, and I understand that Jesus is not more important than my dad. But and I've grown so much in my faith since then. But that was one thing. We went to church every Sunday, and we moved to Michigan. We never went to church again. And I missed that. And so when I got pregnant with our first child, of course we were going to start going back to church again. And so my husband is Lutheran, and so we started going to a Lutheran church here in the town we live in, and just grew so much, and started reading the Bible and reading devotionals and learning so much about the Christian faith and what it really means to be a Christian. And I think that foundation has really gotten me through a lot of really hard times. My husband spent 1.5 years in Iraq, and it was in the very early days of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And so I was a married single mom for, all those months, and that was hard. And he went through a lot of stuff, and that was hard. and he came back. And that was hard. And unfortunately, in 2016, I had a second trimester miscarriage, and that was hard. And my oldest son is dyslexic, and school for him was so difficult, to the point that I decided to go back and get a teaching degree so that I would be able to help him better. And that was hard. So there were so many hard things. And I really think that the foundation of having faith and belief really made a difference. And I always believed that I would be okay in that. But also, just a little tidbit, when I was in my 20s, I met this girl. And when you talked to her, she practically giggled everything out. She always was just such a happy presence. And I remember thinking, that's how I want to be, because I was pretty negative when I was in my 20s. And I didn't realize that there's really a difference between saying, I hate winter, and I'm more of a summer girl. And so everything that I said and my whole demeanor had a lot of vitriol, and I didn't mean for it to. And so that was part of healing as well, is learning how to count my blessings and be positive and choose happiness.
Well, you not only chose happiness, you really chose faith as your foundation, which really, I think, is the basis of what you relate to when you go through those hards, when you go through those struggles, even through the good times. It seems like you always came back to your faith. Tell us, I want to go back a little bit more. I want you to tell us about your book, Through the Fog. Do you have a release date on that?
I do not. I am hoping to have the entire thing written and ready for editing by my birthday this year. My birthday is Cinco de Mayo, if anyone wants to send me a card. So I'm hoping by May 5th that I will have the entire thing written. It's been a challenge because there's so much negative, and it's just part of the story. It just is how the story is. But I didn't want someone to have to pick that book up and be, wow, I don't want to read this anymore because it's terrible. So I really looked to the book and movie, The Pursuit of Happiness, and I liked how he told it in flashbacks. And so it's really told in flashbacks that kind of go back and forth between how it is now, which is awesome, by the way, and how it was then, and how I managed to get through that. And I really want to help other people recognize in maybe themselves when things are toxic and when things are abusive, as well as maybe seeing someone else. If you see somebody who is very withdrawn, are they really a withdrawn person, or are they afraid to speak? And I'd love for people to get help for that.
And you hit on something really important there. And I just want to add to that a little bit. We really never know what somebody else is going through, whether they're withdrawn, whether you sense that they may be going through something. Obviously, what transpired with my son, and I often refer back to that because people knew what was happening, but it's so difficult to explain to someone how you're feeling and in that moment as a parent, as a caregiver, as whatever you may be going through. So I'm wondering if perhaps with your book coming out, hopefully like you said, you'll have it done by Cinco de Mayo. Send her a birthday card. But the purpose being that you can reflect and say, wow, that's kind of a messy situation she went through, but look at how she was able to rely on her faith. Look at how she was able to persevere and go forward in life and really build an amazing business.
Yeah, exactly. I think that you hit on something too, and that is that sometimes you don't know how you're feeling, and that's okay. And you don't have to have a name for every feeling that you're having. Sometimes it's okay to just feel it. And so I think that with the business now, every now and then I'm still haunted by those past feelings and what I have a coach named Belinda, and I think that you know Belinda as well. And Belinda is amazing, and she calls it chicken chatter, and it's that little voice in the back of your head that is telling you you're not good enough or that they don't like you. And I had a call with somebody, and she didn't show up. And I thought, she doesn't like me. She probably just spaced it because I'm not a priority for her, and she just doesn't really care for me, and she never rescheduled. And so then that's all the more reason to be, think, oh, she, and you know what? I've learned that it's okay. Maybe she doesn't like me. Maybe she does. Maybe she's just really busy and it's just slipped her mind, and that's okay too. And that's really hard for somebody coming out of that emotional abuse to recognize that it's okay if somebody doesn't like you, because above all, you just want people to like you.
Right, exactly. And I just want to segue over and welcome all of our amazing listeners currently with us on the Wisdom Audio app. Thank you all so much for being here today. Kristine, would you maybe be up for maybe one of our listeners coming up on stage just to add to the conversation, or perhaps ask you a question? Are you okay with that?
Absolutely.
So Wisdom listeners, if someone wants to come up on the stage here, we have time for one guest to pop on up. We'd love to hear from you if you have a question or if you would like to add to the conversation. Kristine, excuse me, where can our viewers and listeners get in contact with you?
So on my website, you can visit upvirtualadministration.com. That is my VA business website. And also, kind of a fun thing, I am actually building out a writing portfolio. So there will be in my portfolio, which is one of the buttons on my homepage, you will see a blog, and that's just some private writing that I've done. It's not professional writing, it's creative writing. And I really urge everyone to read the junk drawer story. It is a story that is just a fun, funny story about a junk drawer that fell apart while my husband was in Iraq, and what happened to get it remedied.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for that information. Of course, I'll make sure that gets in the show notes. Everybody has a junk drawer, and that may be a story all within itself, correct?
Yes, it is. It's just a fun story about a new house that we had that even though all of the cabinets obviously were brand new, that one drawer just wouldn't stay together.
Oh my goodness. Speaking of junk drawers, do you have a junk drawer at home right now?
Absolutely, we do. And it's not falling apart, but I think that's a great metaphor, because I think a lot of people have a junk drawer that just won't stay together. I think, isn't that a great metaphor for our lives?
Yes, it is. Oh my gosh, this has been such an amazing conversation today. And we have yet to continue, obviously, the conversation. I hope that you will definitely consider coming back on again, especially when we have a very specific release date for your book.
Yes, I would love to do that.
Wonderful. Well, Kristine, I want to thank you so much for being here today, sharing your vulnerability, sharing your story in such a way that people can really listen in and kind of gather their thoughts and perhaps take action in their own lives. Thank you so much. Wisdom, thank you so much for being here today. Remember, everyone, if you have a story to share, and maybe it's similar to Kristine's story, but you know what? Somebody needs to hear it because that will inspire you to take action in your lives. Please feel free to reach out to me. You can, of course, reach me through the Wisdom Audio app or through the Stories That Inspire Us Facebook page. My name is Janice Malillo, the host of Stories That Inspire Us. Today, I was inspired by Kristine's amazing story. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me, Janice.
You're so welcome. Well, we shall see you again real soon, and bye for now.